Okay, before we get into how we find limits, we're going to look at 8 basic properties or facts of limits. And these are just rules. They're probably pretty self-explanatory. They're not really that big of a deal, but we need to know them just because we need to know them. The first one is here, the constant function rule. The constant function rule says that the limit of a constant function, which is just a number, with a limit of 3, for example, as x approaches any number is going to be the constant itself. We say that here the limit of a constant function is itself. Pretty straightforward on that one. If we scroll down and we look at the identity function, so if we have a function like y equals x, the limit as x approaches c is going to be the constant itself. I hope you see the subtle difference between those two. One is going to be the actual constant if the function is the constant. The one is going to be the number it's approaching if it's an identity function. So the limit of the identity function is the value it's approaching. We scroll down and we look at the sum rule. The sum rule says that if I have two functions and I'm adding them together, I can take the limit of each function separately at that point and I get the sum of the limits. So the limit of the sum of two functions is the sum of their limits. Again, don't get too thrown off on all of this. It will come clearer, but I just want you to understand and know these and see these rules before we start talking about actually how to find limits. The difference rule, just like the sum rule, if I'm finding the difference of two functions as x approaches a number, then I subtract those two functions, the limits of those two functions. And we say the limit of the difference of two functions is the difference of their limits. Clear as mud, right? Moving on. We have the product rule. Same concept. If I have a limit as x approaches some number of two functions that I'm multiplying, I could take the limit of each function separately and just multiply the results. So the limit of a product of two functions is the product of their limits. Constant multiple rule. This one comes in handy quite a bit, especially when we're finding derivatives, because we can always take a constant out. So for example, if I have a constant in front of a function, I can take that out before I find the limit of that function. This will apply in derivatives too, so keep this in mind. And the limit as that approaches will be that constant times the limit. So we can factor it out before we find the limit, put it back in. That's basically what that says. The limit of a constant times a function is the constant times the limit of the function. These are fun to say sometimes, right? Wrong. All right, quotient rule. Quotient rule, same thing as product rule. If I can divide them, then I can divide their limits, except, of course, if the limit of the denominator is 0. Can't do that. So the limit of the quotient of two functions is the quotient of their limits. The last one is the power rule, and there's a whole bunch of stuff in the rule that says R and S have to be real numbers and so on. We're just going to assume that at this point that everything that we put into these are valid. So in this one, the limit as x approaches some number of a function to a power is the same as finding the limit of that function and then just taking that to the power. So the power doesn't have to throw us off on those. We can just find the limit of the function and take it to the power as well. So when we say the limit of a rational power of a function is the power of the limit. So that's it. Those are the 8 basic rules of limits. The next video I'm going to introduce you to will be actually doing some of these limits. And we're going to start off by, there's multiple ways we can do it. We're going to start off with some of the simpler ones, which would include tables, kind of like the one that you did with the instantaneous rate of change. And the other one will involve substitution. When we can use substitution, it's usually the best way. We can't always, but that's the best way if we can. So I will get into those next, and we are done here.